Right, now we have the part two set of notes on natural selection. And this first picture is a portrait actually of Charles Darwin when he was fairly young. It says he was a biologist, a naturalist, very curious about nature, and he studied the animals of the Galapagos Islands in 1835. That's when he arrived at those islands. But he studied a lot of different animals in a lot of different parts of the world on his voyage on that ship called the Beagle. Let's watch a video.
The 13 large Galapagos Islands formed 3 to 5 million years ago, when undersea volcanoes created an island chain 960 kilometers from any other land. The organisms that flew, floated, or otherwise made their way to these islands were isolated. Over millions of years, these organisms adapted to their unique island environment differently than the species back on the mainland. In 1831, biologist Charles Darwin and the crew of the HMS Beagle set sail from England on what would become a 5-year expedition around the world. When they reached the Galapagos in 1835, the unique creatures they found there fueled Darwin's scientific curiosity. Darwin found many species he had never seen before. He also noticed differences within the Galapagos species from one island to the next, such as tortoises with different types of shells, and finches with different types of beaks. Darwin made detailed notes and sketches of the species he encountered and collected thousands of specimens. When he returned to England, he spent the next 20 years analyzing and interpreting his findings and doing further research in biology and geology. Finally, in 1859, he presented his groundbreaking hypothesis. In The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, Darwin put forth a controversial argument for his day, that all species changed over time, or evolved.
Okay, and on the video it mentioned quite a few different animals. This says Darwin studied finches on the Galapagos Islands, and you saw his drawings of finches. Man, he was amazing, not only with his thinking, but he was really talented artistically. He could really sketch, and thankfully, I mean, he was able to bring back almost perfect drawings of a lot of the species that he studied, as well as a bunch of specimens. Brought them back to England with him, and then he studied for a long time and decided a lot of different things about all the specimens and the drawings and the notes he had made, really for about 40 years almost. Their beak adaptations have allowed them to take advantage of food sources from the different habitats found on each island. So it shows 4 of the species of Darwin's finches. You got a large ground finch there, cactus finch, vegetarian finch, and a woodpecker finch. That particular finch uses a thorn from a bush or a cactus to actually probe into a tree and get a larva, whatever, beetle larva or worm or something like that out of the tree. So they're actually tool users, which isn't that common in nature. So Darwin's studies led him to come up with a theory based on the process of natural selection. Let's check out another video.
In the 1820s, surgery was a grisly affair. There was no anesthesia, and young medical students were forced to watch and learn. The young man who walked out that day was Charles Darwin. The ordeal of the operating room was too much for him. Over his father's objections, he quit medical school to pursue his dream of becoming a naturalist. Darwin was hired as a naturalist aboard the British Admiralty's HMS Beagle, which embarked on an expedition to survey and map coastal waters around the world. The Beagle was at sea for 5 years. To Darwin, it seemed an eternity. He shared a small cabin with the captain, with whom he had several disagreements, including the story of creation.
Dolly.
While the captain held to the Bible's account of creation, Darwin believed that the earth had changed slowly over millions of years. It was a debate that would follow Darwin for the rest of his life. The British government paid for this?
No, actually, Darwin's father paid for his voyage and also paid for an assistant to come with Darwin and help him skin the specimens and prepare the crates for shipment. He worked in a little poop deck where he had all his specimens, just about something like this.
The Beagle made stopovers in ports from Australia to South America, including 36 days in the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin made the most of it. He recorded extensive observations about the indigenous plants and wildlife. He collected and preserved thousands of specimens for study. For years after the voyage, Darwin would recall the observations he made while aboard the Beagle.
It was not until 1837, a couple of years after he returned from the Galapagos, that he opened his first species notebook, and he asked himself the question, very ambitious question for a man in his late 20s, what are the laws of life?
Is this Darwin's whole point?
It was Darwin's whole point, to try to find laws operating in the natural world similar to the laws that physicists and chemists had found in inorganic nature.
Darwin's search to understand the laws of nature took shape as he studied the animals on the Galapagos Islands. Of special interest to him were the physical differences within a certain species. For example, the finches on the Galapagos had different shaped beaks. They varied according to the environments where the finches lived. Some had beaks that were hard and blunt, ideal for hammering open crab shells. Others had beaks that were more tapered and suited for hunting and pecking among rocks. The difference was puzzling. As Darwin analyzed it, he began thinking about how the struggle to survive was the driving force behind all life. If the species is to thrive in its environment, it has to evolve or perish. With this simple yet powerful insight, history was made. Darwin discovered the mechanism that made evolution work, the process of natural selection. Darwin wasn't the first guy really to come up with this, right? What was his special or particular insight?
He was the first to come up with a specific mechanism, that is natural selection. He was the first to popularize the idea of deep time, millions of years that this process involved. He was the first to popularize the idea of the tree of life, in which we're related to all living things. The great geneticist Dobzhansky once said, nothing in biology makes sense without evolution. Because biology today is evolutionary biology. That's what biology is all about, and has been all about since 1859. How we got here, what kind of creatures we are, how we're related to everything else in nature. It's been established we are all part of one great tree of life, plugged into a bloodline, to a DNA that links us to every living thing on Earth. That's not metaphorical. That's literal.
Why did it take Darwin 20 years to publish his ideas?
He knew there would be a storm of religious protest. His own wife was not happy that he was going to write things that were incompatible with the Bible. She wrote him a letter when they were first married saying, I hope that your science will not lead us to spend eternity in two very different places.
Wow.
And she was seriously concerned about this. Plus, he was trying to build up a mountain of evidence that would be incontrovertible.
Finally, in 1859, Darwin published his theory of natural selection. His book, Origin of Species, is considered one of the greatest books ever written. People talk about the theory of evolution, right? But Darwin was the guy that said, Well, there isn't any absolute truth here.
Darwin, being one of the first modern thinkers, tried to tell us that science is provisional. It changes.
What do you mean by provisional?
It means it's the best truth you have at the moment. And when you get more data that can't be explained that way, then you have to get a new theory. So it's not an eternal truth. It's a provisional truth. It changes. And he did not want evolution to be accepted as a dogma or a creed. He would have been the first to say, throw it out if you got something better.
But we didn't find anything better.
We didn't find anything better. In fact, what we found was that entire new sciences that were undreamed of in Darwin's day have come up through the study of molecular genetics and DNA, which reinforce the idea of evolution, so that now everywhere we look today, we see something that came from Darwin in science.
So you heard the gentleman speaking about Darwin and saying, by the way, yes, that was Bill Nye. But you heard the other guy who was interviewing talk about Darwin wanted to really learn what the laws of life were. People knew about the laws of chemistry, the laws of physics already. That stuff had already kind of been established at that point. But the laws of biology, the laws of life hadn't really been established. That's what he was really interested in. Here's a kind of a genetic family tree of the finches that live on those islands. There's 13 Galapagos Islands. There's actually another island that's pretty close. So you see 14 finches here. It's not technically a part of the Galapagos Islands, but there's another finch species that's made its way to that island, and it's a whole separate species too, and they didn't discover that till a little bit later. But Darwin theorized that all these species of finches, and for birds, it's not that hard for them to colonize an island, right? They can fly over. Some of these other animals, like the iguanas and the tortoises, they had to kind of make their way over to those islands by natural rafts, trees falling over, branches, that kind of thing. That's how those animals make it over to those islands. But the Galapagos Islands are like 500 miles to the west from South America. The mainland is South America. And the country that would be closest, I guess, would be Ecuador. And Ecuador is named Ecuador because of the equator. And so the Galapagos Islands are right on the equator. And that's a good ways away. The birds, like I said, it wouldn't be as big a deal for them to make it over to that island because they're able to fly, obviously. But he theorized, he thought all these came from one species on the mainland back in South America. Right? All these different species of finches. How could he know that? How could he prove that? I mean, yes, he studied them. Yes, he took specimens and he looked at them for a long time before he theorized that. But he had that in his head. There's no way he could prove that. How could he prove that? How could he prove this? Well, really technically couldn't. He knew it in his head. He was convinced. But biologists now have applied modern methods of DNA analysis to Darwin's finches. Not surprisingly, for Darwin was almost always right. Though he knew of neither genes or DNA, those words weren't in his vocabulary at that time, guys. We're talking about the 1850s, almost 1860 when he wrote his book. They have found that finches are all descended from a single ancestral species, and now they can take DNA from that one species, which is not extinct, that lives on the mainland of South America, and compare it to the DNA of all these finches on the islands. And he was absolutely correct about his theory. He was, without any doubt, correct about his theory because DNA evidence is 100%. The science of genetics is totally linked to the science of biology now. Our advancements with that science have really proven so much about everything. But he was absolutely correct with his theory here. He's another one of those that was way ahead of his time in his thinking and how intelligent he was. Unbelievably intelligent individual. And Thank goodness he was so curious about these things and he wanted to study these things because we know so much more about life because of him.